I am sorry I cannot be there with you in person, but as I had been writing this, and as I am speaking to you now, I'm in the midst of covering the story unfolding in Ferguson, Missouri. Now notice I did not say I was covering the shooting death of Michael Brown. Don't get me wrong, no matter the circumstances that led up to it, a dead teenager whose body was left uncovered in the middle of the street for hours while his family, his friends, and even strangers watched would be beyond anyone's imagination, except for the fact that it did happen. Also notice that I did not say I had been covering the indictment or the non-indictment of Officer Darren Wilson. Don't get me wrong, no matter the circumstances that led up to him shooting Brown, it is also true that before due process, Wilson became the poster boy for police brutality, for discrimination, and for racism in America. So with all due respect to Michael Brown and his family, to Officer Darren Wilson and his family, this story goes far beyond what did or did not take place on Canfield Drive just after noon on August 9th, 2014. To characterize it in terms of just those two individuals would be a disservice not only to them, but to the magnitude of what that terribly tragic encounter exposed. People longing to be heard, longing for access, for equal access. Access to a system that they have never felt a part of. That is the generative force behind the anger you see from many of the protesters. The shooting was just the spark. Their feelings gone unresolved and bubbling just beneath the surface, some of the quiet anger turned into rage, which led to misplaced retaliation against shopkeepers and store owners, police officers, and even on the protesters themselves. And as we have seen in so many other instances, from Rodney King to the Watts riots, people unconsciously unaware of the magnitude of their rage sometimes turn that rage inward, either on themselves or their own communities, simply because they don't know how to channel it. No one, they feel, has listened to them. Their feelings and their issues and their concerns have not been validated. Having no productive way to release their frustrations, their struggle for access becomes violent, as it did initially in Ferguson, Missouri. So regardless of whose side you're on, Michael Brown or the officer or somewhere in between, the fight for access is, and always has been, America's story, especially the fight for access for people of color, for the poor, for women, for gay people, for the underprivileged. I understand that American story very well. I was born into that story in 1966. It was the height of the civil rights movement, the dawn of the Black Power movement. Remember those clenched fists at the Summer Olympics in Mexico City? This was the era of Martin and Malcolm and Rosa and Medgar. But it was also the era of Steinem and Friedan and Baldwin and the Stonewall Inn. In 1966, rocks were pelted at Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. by an angry white mob as he marched in Chicago. King would later declare Chicago the American city most hateful towards black people, even more hateful than any southern city. 2 years after I was born, in 1968, he would be assassinated. Malcolm X was assassinated the year before I was born. 2 years before my birth, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed, outlawing discrimination and racial segregation. I was a kid in the summer of '69 when the Stonewall Inn riots went down. Women burned their bras back then in protest. It was a tumultuous time, a tug of war between peaceful nonviolence and by any means necessary. The first was Dr. King. The latter, by any means necessary, was Malcolm X. I bore witness in my early years to all those struggles from a small Louisiana town called Port Allen, just west of Baton Rouge. It was a place where people who looked like me didn't really have much access to anything. To money, certainly not wealth. To government, certainly not political office, to the justice system, in most cases, certainly not due process, to media, definitely not a fair and accurate portrayal or representation. Although my father fought for civil, human, and equal rights, access for people of color as an attorney, that wasn't my particular calling. My particular calling was not as an advocate, not in the traditional sense, not in the traditional manner. My mission was to advocate for truth, for information, and to advocate for knowledge, and it still is. Just recently on my show on CNN, Anthony Bourdain said something to me that was incredibly profound in its simplicity and its conciseness. We were discussing his recent trip to Iran and why he was compelled to learn as much as he did about a country, especially a government, who so often demonizes Americans and our way of life. He said to me, "You cannot be contaminated by knowledge. You cannot be contaminated by knowledge." Brilliant. Think about that. Not only is it true, but it really ups the ante on the whole knowledge is power cliche that we throw around so much. The reason his words resonated with me is because he was really summing up and reflecting back to me how I've always lived my life, what has guided my career, the quest for information and the quest for knowledge. The best way, I believe, to ensure access to all levels of society, in government, in the workplace, is to seek to be informed. And that means to seek the unvarnished truth, no matter how painful or uncomfortable it may be. In my calling as a journalist, and I believe it's a calling because I can't imagine doing anything else, in my calling as a journalist, the quest for access through knowledge and the unvarnished truth consistently forces me to do something that most people rarely do, if ever. It forces me almost daily to challenge my beliefs. I am very often compelled to rethink perceptions that I may have grown up with, perceptions that may have even come from my very own parents. And through that process, invariably, I am made to reevaluate societal norms, to resist conformity, to buck groupthink, to evolve, to become what I have come to know as being truly emancipated. To be truly emancipated is to achieve freedom of the mind. When you own your own mind, no one can own you. When you own your own mind, no one can own you. The very time I thought I was lost, my dungeon shook and my chains fell off. That's how I feel when I say that. That quote was from James Baldwin, my very favorite author. Psychiatrist David Hawkins, when talking about levels of consciousness, puts it this way, and I'm paraphrasing here. The degree to which you challenge yourself to evolve, your level of consciousness, will dictate how you relate to, or even if you choose to relate to, your life experiences. What he is saying to me is that some people identify so much with the circumstances of their birth and their current environment and conditions in which they live that they become it. Hawkins posits that living or believing in shame, guilt, apathy, grief, fear, desire, anger, or pride are lower on the evolutionary scale. He says that one doesn't really start to come into their own until they begin to live and operate from a place of courage, neutrality, willingness, acceptance, reason, love, joy, peace, and then ultimately enlightenment. But it is very difficult for most people to live an enlightened, or as I like to call it, a truly emancipated life, because society acts just like gravity does in pulling you back into the fold. Author and spiritualist Eckhart Tolle has a similar take on this, referring to it as a collective pain body. What does all this have to do with the struggle for access? Here's what it has to do with that. It means that 50 years after the civil rights movement, the women's lib movement, the Stonewall riots, not that equal access has been achieved by any means, but that the means through which it is achieved now and in the future must evolve. Of course, there is still sexism, there's still homophobia, there's Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, racism, classism, and on, and all those phobias and isms must be exposed and confronted and stopped and challenged at every turn. But think about this, and I'm going to use Ferguson as an example because it is the most present one. In this information and technology age, what is the best way to gain access, or to be heard, or to get what you want? Is the best way to burn down a gas station, or loot a liquor store, or turn over a police car, or even to burn a bra? Don't get me wrong, protesting is a brilliant way to garner attention for a struggle or a cause. And we know it worked because it worked for the civil rights movement initially. But because those protests, even in the face of the most violent opposition, were peaceful. They knew that destruction on their parts only served to undermine their credibility. Those protesters, despite not trusting the people in power, had to start the process of trust by sitting at the table. In order to be at the table, you have to be at the table. And you have to listen. And you have to open your mind. Here's the key, okay? You cannot ask someone to do something that you are not willing to do. If you're asking someone to change their mind, you must be willing to change yours. If you're asking someone to change their perspective, you must be willing to change your perspective. If you want someone to re-examine their beliefs, you must re-examine yours. If you are demanding access, you must be accessible. The first step to full and equal access to anything starts up here. It starts in your mind. You can change your future. You can change the future of the world. Become truly emancipated by accessing your mind. Thank you for listening.